Welcome to part 3 of our lecture series on abnormal psychology. We're up to a section on dissociative disorders. Dissociative disorders is when there is a disruption in the integration of consciousness, which includes a person's sense of identity and or perception. That is how they are experiencing the world. And these are usually sudden and temporary changes in consciousness and or self-identity. It's usually in response to extreme stress. So what is going on here? The mind becomes split, operating on multiple levels at the same time. So it's a little bit hard to understand because we take it for granted that our conscious mind, that is our thinking mind, is integrated. But if you think of it this way, it might help. We can do a lot of things automatically and almost reflexively without much conscious thought at all. So, for example, if you've driven your car someplace, you probably are not thinking while you're driving of every move you have to make to operate the car. You're not thinking, put the foot on the gas, put the foot on the brake, hit the turn signal, look over your shoulder. You're not thinking of all that. You're doing it automatically because you've been doing it for years. And it's a skill that's become ingrained. While you're driving, you might be listening to music, listening to a podcast, having a conversation, thinking about your day. But you arrive safely at your destination usually, and you don't think about, you can't remember all those little behaviors that you did to get you there safely without having an accident. And so you can operate on more than one level at the same time. There's multiple levels of functioning. So now imagine a person that's in extreme stress. Something's happened that is highly stressful. Their thinking or their self-perception starts to split off. And so the first example of this is amnesia. Now there's a couple types of amnesia. There's the type of amnesia that comes from getting a concussion, having being in an accident, having a brain injury, basically. And that is not dissociative amnesia. If you're in an accident or you have some kind of brain injury, you may not remember things because your memories can't be consolidated because there's literally tissue damage, right? So, I mean, it would make sense that your brain can't work if it's injured. So we're not talking about that kind of amnesia. We're talking about the kind of amnesia that happens as a result of stress, and it's usually losing your identity. That often includes even not knowing your own name or personal information. However, you would probably still remember certain things. For example, if you speak 2 languages, you would still know the 2 languages. If you have a particular skill, like playing an instrument or a craft or something like knitting or something, you would still know how to do that. So, and you might have some childhood memories. So it's a little strange to suddenly not know who you are, but it does occur. And so people will sort of wake up and find themselves in a strange city or lost, or they can't remember who they are. And typically they end up in a hospital emergency room or at a police station, and the process begins of trying to track down who these individuals are. And do they recognize loved ones when they're found? Not necessarily. So it can be extremely frustrating for everyone involved. Does the identity come back? Again, it depends. Sometimes things slowly come back, sometimes not. Okay, so it is a sort of a strange, rare disorder. Fortunately, it does not happen that often, but it does seem to be in response to stress, like hearing some really bad news or just living under extreme circumstances. Yeah, now dissociative identity disorder, used to be called multiple personalities. And there have been a lot of movies and books and TV shows all based on this disorder. And it's very fascinating. The problem is it's not 100% clear that it's a real thing. But so that debate is still out. Because it's so rare, it's hard to do research on this. But the idea is that there's the presence of two or more distinct personalities or individuals or identities that take turns controlling the person's behavior. So one minute you might be Mary, the next minute you might be Jane. And these identities can be of various genders, various ages, and each identity has its own personality, its own name, its own behavior pattern. So they can seem quite distinct from one another. They can seem like really different people inhabiting the same body. So it is a very bizarre thing. There's a lot of debate as to whether this is a real thing, like that the person really is not aware of these multiple identities, or if it's a special form of acting. Okay, so each person has, would have its own way of relating, but it's just really unclear whether it's a real thing or not. Now, evidence for this would make a little bit of sense. It tends to start in childhood. So imagine a child who is under severe stress because of probably physical or sexual abuse. It's ongoing. Children have amazing imaginations, right? So we know that about children starting around the ages of 3, 4, and 5. They're used to play acting. They can role play games while they're playing. They can pretend to be, a princess or a horse or anything they want. So one thought is that during the abuse, the child will start to pretend to think it's not happening to me, it's happening to somebody else. And they can create an identity in their minds as to who that other person is, or take themselves out of the abuse by sort of, it's not happening to me, it's happening to someone else. And that becomes ingrained into the way the person handles stress. So that's one thought of how this, if it's true, that this might develop. You see in the box there on the bottom right, two other terms, depersonalization and derealization. So those are very related terms, very sort of similar terms. Depersonalization is when you feel like you're not yourself, like you know who you are. It's not amnesia, but you just feel like this isn't me. I don't feel like myself. And derealization is similar in that you feel detached from the environment you're standing in, that everything around you feels unreal. In both cases, it's brought on by stress. If you have ever if you've ever received some sudden, very bad news, and you have that sensation, that feeling of, I can't believe it, that's just not real. You feel a little bit detached from reality in that moment. You would get a sense of, it's like a little example of what these two symptoms are. So they are also temporary. As the person adjusts to the reality of whatever the bad news is, they come back to integration again in their feelings. Okay, so dissociative identity disorder used to be called multiple personality. And one last point to make is this is not schizophrenia. So people have the stereotype of schizophrenics being split personality or multiple personality. That is incorrect. So you'd want to know the difference there. Okay, so matiform disorders are also called illness anxiety disorders. So again, look at that root, soma, way back from our biology chapter, the soma of the cell body, that is the cell body, the soma of the cell is the cell body. So here we have that same root word again. Soma means body. So a somatoform disorder are a couple of types of disorders having to do with the physical body. Now, illness anxiety disorder used to be called hypochondria. And you may have called somebody a hypochondriac if they always think they're sick. So that's basically what it is. It's a diagnosis given when a person insists that they have a serious illness in spite of all the tests to the contrary. Now, again, this is not the same thing as a person who has psychosomatic disorders like stress headaches or stress stomach aches or, you know, some kind of pain. That's a little different. Those people aren't hypochondriacs. They have physical pain in reaction to stress. So illness anxiety disorder is when a person feels like they have a serious illness, even though no serious illness can be found. The person is preoccupied with physical sensations and changes. And here's what's really strange about these folks, or what makes this diagnosable. These patients will go to every different doctor until they can find somebody to do every test they want, looking for bad news. And then when they get good news, they're not relieved. So if you thought you had cancer and you went to a doctor and said, hey, I'm worried about this mark on my skin or lump or whatever, can you check me out? And the doctor says, sure. And they check you out. They said, listen, all is well. You don't have cancer. This is normal, blah, blah. You go, oh, thank goodness. Great. Thank you. And you leave and go about your life. People with illness anxiety disorder are not relieved. They think that the doctor doesn't know what they're talking about. They think, well, the doctor didn't do the test properly or the test missed something. And so they go to find another doctor. That is really the hallmark of this disorder. So I did have a patient with this disorder. I've had a couple of patients with it actually. But one lady in particular was obsessed with whether she had cancer. And it was ironic because she wasn't obsessed with whether she could have had heart disease, which her father had, or, dementia, which also ran in her family. She didn't worry about those whatsoever. Everything was about cancer. So she'd show me a little spot on her hand and she'd say, do you think this is cancer? And I'd go, no, but have you had it looked at? Well, my doctor says it's not cancer. Well, I think you need to take your doctor's word for it. And she would literally look for signs of cancer in all aspects of her body, including after she would use the toilet, putting on rubber gloves and looking through her feces for signs of blood. And I realized what she was doing. She said, I found red spots in my stool. I go, wait a minute, are you looking through your feces? And she said, yes. So she said, I found some red spots there. I go, well, did it look like blood? She goes, no. I said, have you eaten anything? She said, I had some cranberries. I go, well, that could be it. Right? So really, really, it is sort of a form of obsessive compulsive disorder that centers on physical symptoms and issues. So overly focused on physical sensations and changes, even though, of course, our bodies change all the time and these changes are normal. And so what was her deal? She was obsessed with the fact that her son was growing up, her only child, and really didn't need her anymore. And those happy days she had as a young mother were changing. And she really needed a new identity, a positive identity for herself, since mom of a young child wasn't working anymore. She needed to find out what else she could do with her life that would be meaningful. And so we focused on her going back to work because she had been a stay-at-home mom. And when she went back to work, she, of course, was distracted from all of this obsession, but she also found that people really liked her at her job and she was good at it. And so it gave her something new to focus on and to be proud of. So, okay, so that is illness anxiety disorder. The last one we're going to talk about here is called conversion disorder. And that is when there is a major change in physical functioning that has no medical explanation. The person is not supposedly faking it. They're not pretending. Something happens to them. So, for example, a person might suddenly go blind or have a form of paralysis or an inability to feel certain parts of their bodies. So the name conversion disorder comes from a Freudian concept where the Freud said that the anxiety and the stress converts into physical symptoms. But so the name just stuck. But what's going on here? So, for example, a person who's in combat, who might be a soldier, would suddenly go blind. Now, if you've got a soldier in your unit who's suddenly blind, they are a liability, right? What do you do with them? So you have to get them back to, I guess, base camp or whatever, back to safety behind the out of combat. So, when the doctors examine them, there's nothing wrong with their eyes, there's nothing wrong with their optic nerve, there's nothing wrong with their brain, but they feel like they can't see. Other people might feel a sense of paralysis. The key symptom here is called la belle indifférence, which is French for the beautiful indifference. And this is how you know if a person has this disorder. If you suddenly went blind, or if you suddenly felt like you were paralyzed, I think you would be very concerned about that and upset and seek treatment and get scared. But with these individuals, they don't. They are not concerned with the loss of functioning. And that's what's so strange about it. And I did have a patient with this. This is pretty rare, but a couple came to see me where it was a middle-aged couple. They're very stressed in their relationship. And the wife would go into these sort of seizure type of movements. She would shake and she would fall on the floor. And, people would rush to her side. Oh, what's wrong? She refused to see a doctor. And she really wasn't that concerned about these so-called seizures. And it drove her husband crazy. Like, how we can't function as a family with this going on. And I said to him, just ignore her. And he was pretty shocked. But I'm thinking of reinforcement theory. He said, you mean just step over her while we're making our pizza? And I said, yes. So he brought her to session with him. And I thought she's going to have to test me. And I thought, she's going to have one of these episodes right here. And sure enough, she did. So she started in with the shaking just as soon as the conversation between the two of them started to heat up a little bit. She went into one of these episodes. Now, again, if it was you and you were going into a seizure-like episode, I don't think you would start to stand up and walk around. I think you'd stay seated. She stood up and started to walk around. And, I thought, oh, gosh, what do I do, right? But she walked over towards her husband. He was sitting in his own chair. And while she's shaking and everything, she turned around with her back to him, and he stood up and she fell into his arms. So it was just like right on cue. I mean, if she's trying to suggest that she can't control these seizures, she went right to him and let him catch her. So he kind of put her on the ground and she stayed shaking there on the floor. And I was like, what do I do? I'm thinking to myself, I said, well, first of all, I'm not going to touch her because I'm not a medical doctor. And I just had this feeling that this was going to go away. I mean, should I have called 911? I don't think so, because how it turned out, I did the right thing. I looked at him and I said, why don't we go back and continue our conversation? And when she's feeling better, she'll rejoin us. And he said, okay. And, I kept my eye on her while we were talking. It took maybe less than a minute. She kind of stopped all the shaking and she sort of sat up and kind of, tugged at her blouse to kind of adjust her clothing. And she got up and she came and sat back on the couch. So, I mean, to me, this just cemented that this was a conversion disorder. Now, that doesn't mean she wasn't suffering. It doesn't mean she was trying to pull the wool over somebody's eyes. I think she had convinced herself that this was quite real. But I think it was reinforced. I think it was a symptom that was reinforced by the family, giving her a lot of attention and also allowing her to escape lots of unpleasant conversations and lots of unwanted chores. So she didn't do the grocery shopping anymore. She didn't do the cleaning anymore. She didn't do the cooking anymore. And everybody just kind of adjusted their lives around her. So again, going back to our chapter on learning, this was positively reinforced for her. She got what she wanted, and she was able to escape stressful situations, stressful, um, chores and conversations by doing this disorder. She was able to escape. So the unpleasantness was that was a negative reinforcement that the unpleasant demands were removed, and positive reinforcement that she got to do what she wanted and got all this caring attention. So again, very, very rare disorder. Key thing here is the fact that she was not interested in seeing a doctor for these so-called almost daily seizures. Okay, so that wraps up our little section here on dissociative and somatoform disorders, and come back for part 4.